They said she was too much, too heavy, too stubborn, too unlovable. So her own father handed her over to an Apache warrior, like property in a land dispute. But what was meant to humiliate her became the greatest turning point of her life, because the man everyone called a savage saw something no one else ever had her worth. What if punishment could become redemption? What if love could grow from the ashes of disgrace? If you believe in second chances, quiet strength, and the healing power of unexpected love, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Each story we share is crafted to stir your heart, offer hope, and remind us all that sometimes the most broken paths lead to the most beautiful destinations. Now let us take you back to the scorching deserts of the American West, where a single father, a discarded noblewoman, and a silent warrior began rewriting fate itself. The sun showed no mercy over Fort Benson. It beat down on the parched earth with a fury that cracked wagon wheels and split the lips of the living. Dust clung to every boot, every breath, every whispered insult, carried on the dry wind. At the edge of the courtyard, Miriam Whitmore stood as still as the sandstone cliffs in the distance, her cheeks flushed with heat and humiliation. She was suffocating inside her corset, her traveling gown clinging wetly to her back, her breathing shallow. Yet she held her head high. She would not give her father the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Across from her, flanked by soldiers and 2 silent aides, Baron Whitmore sat tall atop a dapple-gray stallion, his eyes cold and flat beneath the brim of his white sun hat. "This is your punishment," he announced, his voice sharp as a gavel cracking down in a courtroom. "Your gluttony, your defiance, your failure to uphold the Whitmore name. This is the cost." There was a murmur among the men gathered around the fort. Traders, ranch hands, and a few cavalrymen paused their work to witness what they surely thought was a strange and shameful scene. Miriam clenched her jaw. She could feel their eyes, some mocking, some curious, none kind. She had always been too much, too tall, too full, too loud, too opinionated. Her suitors had fled one by one. No dowry, no title, not even her pretty face. Nothing could outweigh what society saw when they looked at her body. But today, Miriam realized it wasn't just rejection. It was exile. Elias Greyhawk Baron Whitmore called out, addressing the broad-shouldered Apache man standing a few paces away. "As agreed. In restitution for our land dispute, I offer my daughter. She will serve your people however you see fit." Miriam's head snapped toward her father. "You're giving me away," her voice cracked. To him, silence, he barked. "You had every opportunity to be something. A wife, a woman of value. You squandered them all." Elias didn't flinch. He stood calmly in a worn leather vest, a band of turquoise beads wrapped around one wrist, his eyes shaded and unreadable. He had not spoken a word since arriving, but Miriam felt the weight of his gaze, calm, not cruel, curious, not covetous. He gave one solemn nod. "She's yours now," Baron Whitmore declared, already turning his horse. "Do with her what you will." Miriam stared at her father's back as he trotted away. He didn't glance behind. Not once. The world tilted beneath her feet. The next moment, Elias stepped forward, not quickly, not threateningly, and reached toward the bag on the ground beside her. Miriam instinctively stepped back. "I won't run," she said, the fire in her voice barely masking her dread. He didn't answer. He simply picked up the small valise of her belongings and gestured toward the gate. Miriam looked around. There was no protest, no delay. The soldiers had turned away. The onlookers had scattered. Even the fort's chaplain had vanished. This was done. She took a deep, trembling breath, and she followed him out of the gates, her boots crunching against gravel, her past sealed behind her like the iron doors of a prison cell. They walked for hours in silence. Miriam tried not to limp, though the heels of her travel shoes weren't meant for the open desert. Her bonnet drooped under sweat and grit. The only sounds were the soft steps of Elias's moccasins and the distant cry of hawks circling overhead. Around midday, he offered her a water skin. She hesitated, then accepted it with a nod. The water was lukewarm, but it was the first act of decency she'd received in days. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, after another hour, her voice hoarse. Elias pointed toward the horizon, a line of faded blue hills, shimmering in the heat haze. "Home." That was the first word he spoke. It landed like a pebble in still water. Miriam looked at him again, truly looked. He didn't seem angry. Not cruel. Just steady. Like a man who had made peace with many things she hadn't yet begun to understand. That night, they stopped near a low bluff and made camp. Elias built a fire with practiced ease. Miriam sat a distance away, hugging her knees, her thoughts racing. She expected him to watch her, to leer, to claim what her father had so callously given. Instead, he handed her a blanket and lay down under the stars, facing away. She stared at the sky, too exhausted to cry, too angry to sleep. But one question burned through her fatigue, louder than all the rest. What kind of man accepts another man's daughter like a piece of property and then treats her like a person? She didn't yet know the answer. But as the firelight flickered, and Elias Greyhawk's steady breath rose and fell beside her in the dark, Miriam felt the first crack in the wall of shame she'd been forced to build her whole life. And through that crack came air. Fresh. Unexpected. Hopeful. Miriam awoke to silence. No bells, no servants, no smell of tea or perfume. Just the scent of mesquite wood lingering in the cold morning air and the distant sound of a hawk slicing through the pale desert sky. Her back ached from sleeping on the uneven ground. Her corset had loosened during the night, a small mercy she hadn't noticed until now. She sat up slowly, brushing dust from her skirts, and looked around. Elias was gone. Panic flared in her chest. Had he left her here? Had her father's final cruelty been to trade her for abandonment? Then she heard it, a quiet sound, deliberate and rhythmic, and turned her head to see Elias crouched near the fire pit sharpening a blade. His long fingers moved steadily over the stone. He didn't look up, but spoke without turning. "There's food." Miriam followed his nod to a small, flat rock near the fire where a handful of dried meat and a few berries rested. She hesitated. She didn't want to take anything from him, not yet, but her stomach didn't care about pride. She ate in silence. When she finished, she finally asked the question that had burned in her throat since the night before. "Why did you accept me?" Elias didn't look up. He continued working the blade slowly, precisely. "The white man does not understand value," he said, simply. Miriam blinked, caught off guard by the calm certainty in his voice. There was no resentment, no accusation, just a quiet truth offered without apology. She opened her mouth, but couldn't find a response that didn't sound foolish. So she stayed quiet. The journey continued. Each day bled into the next, a slow march across sand and scrub and stone. Miriam's shoes disintegrated by the third day. Her feet blistered, her calves cramped, her lips cracked from the dry wind. And still she walked. Elias never rushed her. He never scolded or encouraged. He simply paused when she stumbled and waited without comment. He shared water without ceremony. When she coughed from the dust, he handed her a damp cloth. She expected cruelty. What she got was indifference, wrapped in small mercies. And it confused her. On the fourth night, the wind howled across the plain, and the temperature dropped hard and fast. Miriam sat, shivering, arms wrapped tight around herself, the single blanket no match for the desert cold. Without a word, Elias rose from his spot near the fire, walked to his pack, and returned with a second blanket. He dropped it onto her lap and sat back down, eyes fixed on the flames. Miriam stared at him. No man had ever looked at her without first seeing her size. Not the tailor in Boston who sneered while measuring her gowns. Not the would-be suitors who stumbled over excuses to avoid dancing. Not even her father, who spoke of her as if she were livestock with defects. But Elias looked at her like the wind, looked at the canyon without judgment, without need. Simply there. And in that moment, that absence of disgust, that stillness felt like grace. She wrapped the second blanket tighter and whispered, "Thank you." He didn't respond, but his shoulders relaxed just slightly. By the fifth day, Miriam's breathing was easier. She'd learned to walk in Elias's shadow when the sun was too harsh. She'd learned to tie her skirts higher to keep from tripping. She drank only when thirsty, ate sparingly, and slept with her hand curled around a rock for comfort. She was changing not dramatically, but undeniably. They passed through a grove of desert willows that afternoon. Elias stopped beside a low, spiny shrub and knelt, motioning for her to join him. "Milkweed," he said, pointing to the plant's narrow pods. "Good for cuts. Poisonous if eaten." Miriam nodded, trying to memorize the shape of the leaves. He turned and walked on. After a few steps, he glanced back. "Try naming the others." Miriam hesitated. Then she pointed to a smaller plant nearby. "That one. You said it's yarrow." He gave the faintest nod. Not a smile, but something softer than silence. That night, they camped beside a dry riverbed. The sky above them exploded with stars, thousands uncountable, so bright, Miriam had to squint. She had never seen a sky like this from Boston, where gas lamps and smoke dulled everything. Elias sat a few feet away, back to a rock, sharpening another tool. "Do you live alone?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. Then, not alone. But not crowded. That was enough. She leaned back against a boulder and closed her eyes. Her body ached. Her hands were blistered. She was filthy sunburned and wind-chapped. And yet she felt more real than she had in years. Back east, she had rooms of velvet and silver. Here, she had a single blanket and a stranger who never lied. And somehow, it felt like the beginning of something true. As the fire crackled and the desert sang its dry lullaby, Miriam turned her head toward Elias. "You don't say much," she murmured. Elias didn't move, but his voice reached her softly just above the wind. "I've seen words used to hurt more than silence ever did." Miriam closed her eyes again. She understood that, more than he could possibly know. The village appeared suddenly, carved into the crook of a hidden valley, beneath towering red cliffs. It was smaller than Miriam expected, not the savage encampment her father had described in exaggerated warnings, but a community that breathed with quiet order. She halted at the edge of the trail, overwhelmed. Smoke curled from small cooking fires. Children darted between narrow dwellings, made of branches, hides, and earth. Women knelt beside baskets, grinding corn with practiced rhythm. Men returned from hunting their presence, steady, but not aggressive. Elias turned to her. "Welcome to Haven Creek." Miriam swallowed hard. Her boots were cracked. Her dress hung loose where she'd lost weight, and tighter where dirt clung in stubborn patches. Her bonnet was long gone. She could feel how she looked disheveled, out of place, and too large for a world this lean and efficient. The stairs came fast, curious, cautious. Not cruel, but not kind either. She tightened her grip on the fraying bag in her hand. Her instinct screamed to shrink herself to disappear. But there was no corner of this wide land to hide in now. Elias led her toward a modest dwelling, woven from willow branches and hide. An older woman stepped out as they approached. She was slight wiry, with long gray braids and skin like tanned leather. Her eyes, however, were sharp, scanning Miriam not with judgment, but with evaluation. "This is Mama Elias," said. "My grandmother. You'll stay with her." Miriam opened her mouth to protest, but Elias had already turned and walked away. She stood there stunned. Mima said something in her own tongue, then motioned brusquely toward the doorway. Miriam hesitated. Then, carrying her exhaustion and pride like heavy luggage, she stepped inside. The inside of the home surprised her. It was cool, clean, and purposeful. Woven mats lined the floor. Tools were hung with care. A clay pot of water sat in the corner. Mima pointed to a sleeping mat, and then to the water, as if to say, "This is yours. You may begin." Miriam nodded, murmured a quiet, "Thank you," and felt foolish for doing so when the woman clearly didn't speak English. But Mima paused, turned back, and with a slight nod, acknowledged the sentiment. It was a small thing. But to Miriam, who had been spoken over, traded, and discarded, it felt monumental. That evening, Miriam stood at the threshold of Mima's dwelling, watching the rhythms of the village unfold. Children helped with chores. Women sang softly as they prepared food. No one barked orders. No one demanded perfection. Everyone contributed, and no one looked like her. A tall woman with sinewy arms lifted a basket of firewood, effortlessly, barely glancing in Miriam's direction. A young girl laughed as she tugged on her mother's shawl, oblivious to the newcomer's presence. Miriam felt herself shrinking again, folding inward like a letter no one wanted to read. Mima appeared beside her and handed her a wooden bowl of steaming stew. Miriam accepted it with a murmur of thanks. She sat on a low bench and ate slowly. The stew was unlike anything she'd tasted, smoky, spiced, nourishing. Mima watched her for a moment, then nodded once and returned to her own meal. It wasn't a conversation, but it was connection. In the days that followed, Miriam tried desperately to help. She offered to carry baskets, but her arms gave out. She tried grinding corn, but the rhythm escaped her. She dropped a spindle while trying to spin thread and was met with silence. Not mockery, just silence. The women didn't laugh, but their glances held a weight that stung. Miriam was used to being invisible in a ballroom too large to dance, but too noble to ignore. But here, her nobility meant nothing, and her body seemed like a liability in a world that moved swiftly and efficiently. On the fourth morning, Mima handed her a clay pot and pointed toward the stream. Miriam straightened, determined. "This I can do," she told herself. The stream was farther than expected, the pot heavier, the path uneven. Halfway back, her fingers slipped. The pot shattered on a rock. Miriam stood frozen, staring at the fragments, shame rising like bile. Her hands trembled. Her legs ached. She knelt down to gather the shards, and a jagged piece sliced her finger. Blood welled instantly. A shadow passed over her. She looked up to see Elias standing there, silent as always. She waited for a reprimand, a sigh, disgust. Instead, he crouched beside her, took her hand gently, and examined the cut. From a pouch at his side, he withdrew a soft green leaf, crushed it between his fingers, and pressed it to the wound. The bleeding slowed. "Leave it," he said, quietly motioning to the broken pot. He handed her a smaller water skin from his belt. "Start with what you can carry." She stared at him, stunned, not by his calm, but by the clarity of his words. He wasn't telling her she was weak. He wasn't telling her she was hopeless. He was giving her permission to begin where she was with what she had. It was the first time in her life anyone had done that. That evening, she returned to the village with the small water skin, her stride steadier. She helped Mima prepare the evening meal this time, with hands that didn't shake. When she handed the older woman a bundle of herbs, Elias had shown her, Mima didn't speak, but she placed the herbs into the stew without comment. Across the fire circle, Miriam caught Elias's eye. He didn't smile, but he didn't look away. She took that as enough. Miriam woke to the scent of crushed sage and the soft rustle of Mima, weaving reeds by the hearth. Morning light spilled through the woven roof in broken shafts, painting the dirt floor with golden lines. She sat up slowly, her muscles still sore, but no longer screaming in protest. Outside, the village stirred to life. Children chased one another with feathers in their hair. The thud of pestles against stone filled the air with rhythm. Miriam wrapped the thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and stepped out into the sun. No one stared this morning, not because they'd forgotten her presence, but because they were beginning to accept it. She wasn't yet one of them, but she wasn't quite an outsider anymore. After breakfast, Mima handed Miriam a bundle of herbs and pointed toward the slope outside the village. Miriam knew what it meant gathering. This time, she walked alone. The trail curved gently upward, dotted with wild-growing plants. Elias had begun to teach her to recognize agave yarrow desert mint. She knelt to pick a sprig of mint, testing its scent with a tentative smile. The leaves were soft beneath her fingers, their fragrance fresh and clean. She'd never thought of plants as having personalities. Back in Boston, her world had smelled of perfume and polish of polished mahogany and damp cobblestone. Out here, everything was real and raw, alive and meaningful. Every step into this wilderness brought her closer to something, not survival, not just knowledge, but herself. She returned to find Mima heating water for a poultice. One of the children had cut his leg chasing a wild rabbit through the brush. The gash wasn't deep, but the boy's sniffled eyes wide with fear. Miriam knelt beside him, took the cloth from Mima's hand, and began to clean the wound gently. "You're brave," she said softly, not knowing whether he understood. But he didn't flinch. As she applied the poultice, she glanced up and saw several women watching, not judging, not waiting for her to fail. Watching. When the boy stood and scampered off, his limp, barely visible one of the younger mothers came over and handed Miriam a string of dried berries. A thank you. It was the first time someone had offered her something here without being told to. Her fingers tightened around the gift. A knot formed in her throat. That evening, Elias returned to the village with 2 rabbits slung over his shoulder and a bundle of fresh plants tucked into his belt. He paused at Mima's dwelling, handed Miriam a branch of bitterleaf, and raised an eyebrow. She hesitated, then said, "It calms the stomach, but it's no good for open wounds." A glint of approval sparked in his eyes, not a smile, but close. As twilight settled over the cliffs, Miriam sat by the fire outside Mima's hut, weaving strands of yucca into what might eventually become a basket. Her fingers fumbled often, but she kept going. Across the fire circle, Elias crouched, with 2 younger men sharpening arrows, his movements calm and sure. Mima sat nearby, humming a low tune as she mended a torn satchel. Occasionally, she looked up and watched Miriam with a gaze that held something warmer than tolerance, something closer to pride. Miriam's fingers slipped again, tangling the strands. She sighed in frustration and set the half-woven basket down. Too thick, came Elias's voice. She looked up. He was still across the circle, but nodding toward the strand of yucca in her lap. "Try thinner strips. You don't need to bend the plant. Just guide it." Miriam blinked. "How do you know that?" He shrugged. "I watched my mother make baskets. It was the first personal thing he'd shared. Miriam picked up the strand again, this time with more care. Later that night, long after the fires had dimmed and the village had gone quiet, Miriam sat awake beneath the stars. The night sky stretched endlessly above her, brilliant and humbling. In Boston, the world had been framed by window panes, horse-drawn carriages, and men's expectations. Here, it stretched out forever. She was still large, still awkward in some ways, still unsure. But here, her body felt more like a vessel than a flaw. These hands had carried water, had gathered mint, had calmed a frightened child. She didn't feel small, and for once she didn't want to. The next morning, Miriam stepped out of Mima's hut to find the older woman standing at the edge of the clearing with several villagers gathered around her. At her feet lay a folded shawl, a small bowl, and a length of beaded twine. Mima turned, gestured to Miriam, and said something in the tribal tongue. Miriam froze. Elias stepped beside her. "She's giving you a name," he said, quietly. "A village name. It means you're no longer a visitor." Miriam's heart thundered in her chest. "What name?" He looked at her, his voice low and certain. "Sierra. It means the sky after rain." Miriam stepped forward on trembling legs. Mima draped the beaded twine across her shoulders. Someone placed the shawl in her hands. The small crowd nodded, murmuring softly, their faces open, not smiling wide but at peace. Miriam swallowed back tears. The sky after rain. They didn't see her as broken. They saw her as something that came after the storm. That night, she sat beside Elias under the stars. A gentle breeze played with the loose strands of her hair. "Why did she name me that?" she asked. Elias didn't answer right away. Then, "Because she sees what I see. What comes after pain, after shame. You carry more than you know." Miriam looked at him, really looked. And for the first time since stepping into this strange new world, she believed it. The days grew shorter. Cool winds whispered down from the high cliffs as late summer slowly gave way to fall. Haven Creek moved with a quiet rhythm, now familiar to Miriam. Mornings, filled with chores and gathering afternoons, spent learning with Mima, and evenings circled around firelight. And woven through it all like a thread in a blanket was Elias. He was never far, yet never intrusive. Some days he said nothing at all. Other days he would approach with a sprig of herbs, a sliver of advice, or a single simple question. "Have you eaten, or did you rest today?" They hadn't spoken of her past, or his, but there was a language forming between them built on shared glances, half smiles, and the silence that needed no filling. One evening, Miriam was kneeling near the stream with two young girls teaching them how to strip fibers from yucca leaves. They giggled at her slow pace, but stayed close, fascinated. She was no longer a curiosity to the village children. She was becoming a source of stories, of lessons of care. When she looked up, Elias stood across the stream arms, folded watching. Their eyes met. Neither looked away. Later that night, Miriam found him sitting alone at the edge of the village, where the cliffs fell away to a dark plain stretching endlessly into the horizon. He was holding something small in his hands. Curious, Miriam approached and sat beside him, the soft sound of her skirts brushing stone. He didn't turn, but after a long pause opened his palm. A flute, hand-carved smooth with tiny etchings running down its sides. "My father made this," Elias said, "before I could walk." Miriam leaned in to examine it. The wood was worn but beautiful. He used to say music speaks when words can't. "Did he teach you to play?" Elias nodded. But I stopped, for a long time. "Why?" he hesitated. Then quietly, "When my wife died, the music left with her." The confession came like a breath of wind, softer than sorrow, but heavier than silence. Miriam looked at him. "I'm sorry." He nodded, not in acknowledgement of sympathy, but of truth. She turned her gaze back to the stars. I don't talk about my mother much. She passed when I was 17. After that, my father just hardened. Like everything that made him human went with her. Elias didn't speak, but he didn't move away. Eventually, he raised the flute to his lips. The sound that drifted into the night was haunting melancholy, earthy real. It wasn't perfect. A few notes trembled, but the melody carried something raw, the ache of loss, the shape of memory, and beneath it all, the echo of survival. Miriam closed her eyes. When the last note faded, she whispered, "It's beautiful." Elias turned his head slightly, voice low. "Like you." She opened her eyes. He wasn't teasing. He wasn't trying to flatter. He meant it. And in his gaze, she saw something she had never seen in any man's eyes before. Not hunger, not pity, not calculation, but reverence. Her breath caught. The next morning, Mima handed Miriam a folded piece of hide. It was a vest, simple handmade, dyed with earth tones. It bore a small pattern stitched across the front, the curved wings of a hawk in flight. "Did you?" Miriam turned to Mima. The older woman said something in her native tongue, then pointed to Miriam's chest. Elias translated from behind her. She says, "Your spirit is rising." Miriam swallowed the lump in her throat. "It's beautiful." She says you've earned it. That day, Miriam wore the vest, like armor, not to hide herself, but to honor what she had become. She joined in cooking without waiting to be asked. She corrected a boy's bandage with calm confidence. And when one of the elders asked her to explain how she prepared a certain salve, she answered in halting but understandable Apache, prompting warm laughter and a gentle clap on the back. She was not pretending to belong anymore. She was belonging. That night, as the village gathered to share stories around the central fire, one of the older men asked Elias to play. At first, Elias hesitated, but when Miriam gently nudged his arm and said, "You should," he rose without a word and walked to the center. This time, the tune was different. Still rich with memory, but threaded with something lighter. Hope, perhaps. Or change. Miriam sat quietly, hands resting in her lap. She didn't look at the others. Her eyes were fixed on Elias. He played for the people, but he played toward her. And when the melody ended, and his eyes sought hers in the firelight, there was no need for applause. Only the quiet, certain beat of something beginning. Later, as the stars scattered across the ink-black sky, Miriam and Elias walked back toward Mima's hut. The silence between them was warm. "You said once the white man doesn't understand value," Miriam said softly. "What do you see?" "When you look at me," he stopped walking. She turned to face him. Elias studied her with that unshakable gaze. Then he spoke, slowly, carefully. "I see someone whose body carries life well, whose mind learns, whose hands heal, whose presence calms storms." Miriam blinked hard. "My father said I was too much, too big, too loud, too hard to love." Elias reached for her hand. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just honestly. "Then your father never learned what it means to be strong." She took his hand. And in that single gesture between two people shaped by grief, by exile, by the weight of other people's judgment, a bridge was built. Not yet love, but something that would one day become it. The first frost of the season came overnight. Miriam awoke to the chill pressing against her cheeks, the sky a pale blue dome above the village. Thin threads of smoke drifted from early fires, as Haven Creek stirred quietly beneath a blanket of frost-tipped earth. She slipped into her vest, now worn like a second skin, and stepped outside into the crisp dawn. She was just beginning to gather herbs with Mima when the stillness broke. A shout rang out from the ridge above the village. 2 sentries, young boys, who took turns watching the horizon, came sprinting down the slope, breathless. Mima stood already alert. Miriam turned as Elias emerged from a nearby dwelling, his stride steady, his eyes sharp. Riders, one boy gasped. From the east. Miriam felt a jolt in her chest, cold and immediate, something instinctual, primitive. Elias turned to her. "How many? 12, the boy replied. "Soldiers, and a man in black, dressed like a banker." Miriam's stomach dropped. She didn't need a name, she knew. The village gathered quickly, not in panic, but in purposeful silence. Children were ushered indoors. Women armed themselves with staffs and bows. Elders formed a tight circle near the fire pit, their faces grave but not afraid. Miriam stood beside Elias as the riders approached, dust rising behind them like ghosts. The uniforms were blue and sharp-edged Union-issued cavalry garb, and at their center, astride a white gelding polished to near absurdity, rode Baron Whitmore. He hadn't changed much. His mustache trimmed his jacket impeccable, but the dust clung to his boots like judgment, and the sharpness in his eyes had dulled into something more desperate. He spotted Miriam almost immediately. "Thank God," he said, voice booming across the clearing. "You're alive." She didn't move. Her pulse hammered. She felt Elias beside her, calm, grounded, waiting. "We've come to rescue you," her father continued, turning to the lieutenant beside him. "This is my daughter, Miriam Whitmore, kidnapped months ago and held by force. I demand her immediate return." The word kidnapped felt like a slap. She took a slow step forward. "I wasn't kidnapped," she said, her voice clear. "You gave me away." Baron Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "You were given into custody during a diplomatic negotiation. For your protection." "No," Miriam said evenly. "I was discarded, like a weight you no longer wanted to carry." The lieutenant shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, if she's here voluntarily." "She's been manipulated," her father snapped. "Brainwashed by these savages." Miriam flinched. The word hit her harder than she expected. Not for herself, but for the people who stood quietly behind her watching. The people who had taught her to kneel at the stream, to weave, to heal, to belong. Elias stepped forward, raising one hand in a gesture of peace. His English, when it came, was deliberate and clean. "She stays or goes, by her choice," he said. "Not yours. Not mine." Baron Whitmore's face flushed. "How dare you speak to me?" "I dare," Elias replied, "because she is not property." There was a long silence. The lieutenant turned to Miriam. "Miss Whitmore, do you wish to leave with your father?" Miriam looked at her father, the man who had never truly seen her, the man who had always measured her in disappointments and inches. She shook her head. "No, I'm not going anywhere." The lieutenant nodded slowly. "That settles it." But Baron Whitmore's pride, like brittle glass, shattered. "If I can't have her back," he growled, reaching inside his coat, "then neither will you." It happened in a flash. He drew a small pistol and leveled it at Elias. Miriam screamed, but before the shot could find its mark, a young warrior surged forward, shielding Elias with his body. The bullet struck his shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Chaos erupted. Soldiers drew weapons. Apache warriors raised their bows. For one terrifying moment, blood threatened to stain the frost-white earth. "Hold!" Elias roared, stepping forward with arms outstretched. "No more blood." His voice cut through the tension like a blade. The lieutenant, to his credit, ordered his men to stand down. "Drop your weapons, sir," he barked. Baron Whitmore, red with fury, was quickly disarmed and forced from his horse. Miriam rushed to the injured warrior, falling to her knees. Her hands trembled, but her mind was steady. Elias knelt beside her as she pressed herbs to the wound, binding it tightly with cloth from her own shawl. "He'll live," she whispered. Elias nodded. Later, as the soldiers prepared to escort Baron Whitmore away, now facing charges for attempted murder, Miriam approached her father one last time. He sat, slumped on a rock, bound no longer towering, no longer noble. Just small. "You think I belong in a ballroom," she said softly. "Married off, hidden away. But I found something better here than you ever offered me." He looked at her bitter. "This place made you hard." "No," Miriam said. "This place made me whole." She turned before he could reply, and didn't look back. That evening the village gathered to honor the wounded warrior and the peace that had been protected. Miriam sat by the fire, numb from adrenaline, her fingers still stained with blood and ash. Elias found her there. "You are troubled," he said quietly. She looked at him. "My own father would rather see you dead than accept my choice." Elias didn't flinch. He sat beside her, eyes on the flames. "Some men," he said, "cannot see beyond themselves." "I believed him for so long," Miriam whispered, "that I was unworthy, that I was broken." "To me," Elias said, turning to her, "you are strong, wise, beautiful." Her eyes shimmered. "Your body carries life. Your heart carries compassion. Your hands carry healing. What more could a man want in a woman?" Tears slipped down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from something breaking open inside her, something that had longed to be known. And now, finally was. The morning after the shooting, Haven Creek was quiet, but not broken. The villagers moved a little slower, a little more carefully, as if the memory of what could have happened still lingered in the air like smoke. Children stayed closer to their mothers. The warriors stood taller, but no one spoke of leaving. They had chosen not to flee, and Miriam had chosen to stay. She awoke before dawn in Mima's dwelling, the fire still smoldering. Her hands bore faint bruises from binding the wounded warrior's shoulder, and her body ached from the adrenaline crash. But she felt steady, steadier than she had in months. She wrapped herself in her beaded shawl, stepped out into the cold, and found Elias already at the ridge's edge, watching the sun rise over the eastern plains. "Did you sleep?" she asked. He shook his head, eyes still on the horizon. Miriam stood beside him, their shoulders close, breath visible in the frosty air. "I meant what I said yesterday," she murmured. "I don't regret staying. Not for a moment." Elias turned then. The tiredness in his face did nothing to dull the quiet power of his gaze. "You chose your life," he said simply. "That is a rare thing." Miriam looked out at the morning light spreading over the land. "I think I spent most of my life waiting for someone else to choose for me." Elias nodded. "That's not uncommon, but it's not how we live here." The rest of the day passed in a rhythm of healing and rebuilding. Miriam helped the village women cook a special broth for the wounded. She checked the boy who had taken the bullet, rewrapping the bandage gently as he grinned up at her. Others brought offerings of food and herbs to his family in quiet tribute. No one spoke of vengeance, only gratitude. Later, she helped Mima grind seeds into powder and mixed it with lard for salves. Her hands no longer hesitated. Her eyes didn't wander, second-guessing every motion. She worked with the calm certainty of someone who had learned not from books, but from living. By afternoon, she was in the garden, helping harvest the last of the summer beans. One of the younger women Luma approached and handed Miriam a small carved bead. "For protection," she said in halting English, pressing the bead into Miriam's palm. "From our hearts." Miriam's throat tightened. "Thank you." Luma nodded. "You stayed. So we stay too." It wasn't just about the soldiers. Miriam realized then her decision had become something larger than herself. Her choice to stay when she had every right to flee had given others strength, and in return, they had claimed her as one of their own. That evening, Elias met her outside Mima's dwelling. "I want to show you something," he said. They walked together up a narrow trail winding through the cliffs behind the village. The path was familiar. Now Miriam had climbed it before with him, weeks ago, when he first played the flute for her under the stars. But this time felt different. This time, they walked not as strangers bound by obligation, but as two souls who had chosen each other quietly, steadily, fully. When they reached the ledge, the valley spread below them golden with twilight. The fires of Haven Creek flickered like scattered stars. Elias sat on a flat rock, the same one as before, and reached into his pouch. But instead of a flute, he pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Miriam knelt beside him, heart fluttering. He unwrapped it slowly, a woven bracelet beaded with bone, and turquoise, the pattern simple but precise. "In our way," he said, voice steady, "when a man sees a woman clearly. When he sees her strength, her sorrow, her fire, he offers something handmade." Miriam's breath caught. "I made this the night your father left," he continued. "When I realized you weren't just staying to survive. You were staying because you belonged." He looked at her, then not as a man unsure of his place, but as someone who had found home in another. "I offer this not as payment, not as a gift to impress, but as recognition." Miriam stared at the bracelet in his hands. "My father told me no man would ever want me," she whispered. "That I was too big, too loud, too much." Elias didn't look away. "I want you," he said, "because you are enough. Not in spite of who you are, but because of it." She took the bracelet in trembling fingers and slid it onto her wrist. It fit perfectly. Then slowly she leaned forward, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Haven Creek, she kissed him, not with desperation, but with the quiet, grounded certainty of a woman who had fought to find herself, and finally had. They sat together in silence as the stars blinked into the darkening sky. "You once told me," Miriam said softly, "that the white man doesn't understand value." Elias nodded. "I think I didn't either," she continued. "Not about myself, not until you." He reached for her hand. "You saw us as punishment," he said. "But we were the beginning." She laid her head gently on his shoulder. And for the first time in her life, Miriam felt completely seen. Not for what she could become, not for what she had failed to be, but simply for who she was. The first snowfall came quietly blanketing Haven Creek in a hush of white that seemed to slow time itself. Snow wasn't common in the valley, but when it did come, it was treated not as an inconvenience, but as a gift, a cleansing breath from the earth, a soft invitation to pause. The world shimmered in muted tones, white over red stone smoke, curling against sky, the color of slate. For Miriam, it felt like a page turning. Preparations for the winter ceremony had begun weeks earlier. The village women wove new garments and dusted off ceremonial shawls. Children practiced songs under the guidance of elders. The hunters returned early with extra offerings, rabbits, deer, and herbs dried for midwinter stew. And in the heart of it all, Miriam moved freely, not as a guest, not as someone tolerated, but as Sierra, the name the village had given her, the name she had claimed as her own. Mima pulled her aside the morning of the festival. In her weathered hands, she held a garment, a soft tunic, dyed with pale blue clay and trimmed with beads in the shape of clouds. Miriam gasped. "Is this?" Mima smiled just slightly and gestured for Miriam to lift her arms. As she slipped the tunic over her head, the weight of it settled on her shoulders like a crown, not heavy but grounding. She caught a glimpse of herself in a polished shard of obsidian used as a mirror. She hardly recognized the woman looking back. The skin on her arms was golden from the sun, her once tamed hair woven into a single braid, threaded with feathers and copper wire. Her frame, though still full, now moved with strength. Her hands bore calluses, her eyes something brighter than pride. Belonging. By sundown, fires lit the entire valley. Drums echoed off the cliffs, rhythmic and deep, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Villagers danced in wide circles, shawls sweeping through the air like wind-carried prayers. The scent of wood smoke, pine, and roasted meat filled the air. Miriam stood at the edge of the celebration, her eyes scanning the crowd, until they landed on Elias. He stood a short distance away, dressed in ceremonial leather, dyed deep russet, the hawk emblem stitched proudly on his chest. He was speaking with the elders, but when he caught sight of her, he paused. Their eyes met. And then he crossed the space between them, one purposeful step at a time. When he reached her, he didn't speak right away. He simply extended his hand. Miriam took it without hesitation. He led her through the crowd to a quiet space near the central fire. The drums slowed. The dancers stepped back, forming a wide circle around them. All eyes turned toward Elias. He released Miriam's hand, stepped to the fire, and lifted a small object, a woven crown of yucca and hawk feathers. He turned back to her, and his voice rang out low and clear. In our tradition, a man may ask for a partner, not with words alone, but with work by what he's built, how he's lived, and whom he's chosen to honor. He stepped closer. I offer this, Sierra, not because I need to claim you, but because you have already claimed me. In your strength, in your kindness, in the way you bring peace where there was silence. Miriam felt her breath catch her hand pressed to her chest. This is not payment, he continued. This is a circle. One I ask you to complete. He offered the crown, not forcing, not pleading, offering. Miriam stepped forward. I came here thinking I had been discarded, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. But this place, these people, you, taught me that I had only just begun. She took the crown and gently placed it over her own braid. A hush fell, and then like fire crackling to life, the circle of villagers began to hum a low melodic sound that rose slowly into song. Elias took her hand again, and this time they danced, not as strangers, not even as lovers, but as two lives bound by choice, by respect, and by the unshakable understanding that love was not given, it was earned and grown. That night, as the stars returned in brilliant numbers and the last drumbeat faded, Miriam sat beside Elias at the ridge where he had first played for her. The crown of feathers still rested on her head, now slightly askew from hours of celebration. Was that a proposal, she teased, gently leaning into him? In every way that matters, he said. She smiled. And what comes next? Elias looked out over the valley. Seasons will change. Crops will grow. Children will be born. Some will leave. Some will stay. But this, he turned to her, this is home. Miriam grew quiet. Back in Boston, her name had been spoken in whispers, her sighs discussed like a diagnosis. She had been paraded, shamed, and ultimately traded away. But here, they had given her a name that meant the sky after rain. And tonight, wrapped in warmth and joy, in a people who had embraced her, not despite who she was, but because of it, Miriam finally understood what that name meant. She wasn't the storm. She was the calm. She was the healing. She was Sierra. Spring came early that year. The snow melted into soft rivulets that fed the roots of wild sage and desert marigolds. Children shed their winter furs and ran barefoot through the thawing grass, their laughter rising like birdsong. The entire valley seemed to stretch open and breathe again. Miriam Sierra, now fully and without apology, moved through Haven Creek with purpose and peace. She had become something of a fixture healer teacher, midwife in training. Her days were filled with tending wounds, drying herbs, helping the women prepare salves, and teas from bark and blossom. In the evenings, she sat beside Elias, sharing silence and starlight, with the same comfort as breathing. They hadn't spoken vows in the way she'd once imagined, no white dress, no cathedral bells. But the village had witnessed the offering, the circle, the dance, and in their tradition that was more than enough. One afternoon, while collecting bitterleaf near the ridge, Miriam heard voices approaching unfamiliar clipped eastern. She turned and saw a small party on horseback riding into the village, 3 men in well-kept coats, and 1 woman slender and severe in practical riding gear. At the front was a man in a bowler hat. He dismounted and approached with polite caution. "We're looking for a Miss Miriam Whitmore," he said, clearly unused to calling out across open air instead of through a closed door. Miriam stepped forward, chin high. "I'm Sierra now," she replied evenly. "But I was Miriam." The woman dismounted. She was younger than Miriam expected, her face angular and intelligent. "My name is Margaret Fulton. I'm a reporter with the Boston Herald. I've come to speak with you if you're willing about your story." Miriam blinked. "My story," Margaret offered a folded newspaper. On the front page was a rough sketch of a woman standing beside a man in feathers and leather. The headline read, "Noblewoman chooses life among the Apache." Miriam stared at it for a long moment, then laughed softly. "Is that what they're calling it now?" Margaret smiled, sheepish. "Some of the tabloids have been less respectful. That's part of why I'm here. I want to get the truth from you." Miriam glanced toward the village where children played and fires burned, toward the path where Elias would soon return from hunting. She nodded. "Come. Sit. I'll tell you what really happened." They sat in the shade of Mima's home, sipping warm tea, brewed with desert mint and lavender. Margaret listened carefully as Miriam spoke, not with bitterness, but with clarity. She spoke of being given away like cattle, of blistered feet and endless sky, of a man who offered water without expectation, and a people who taught her how to begin again. Margaret took notes quickly, occasionally glancing up, her eyes wider with every paragraph. "Did you ever consider going back?" she asked gently. Miriam looked at her hands. "Once. For a moment. I missed bread, and hot baths, and books." She smiled. "But nothing I left behind could compare to what I've found here. I don't belong in salons and parlors. I belong in dirt gardens under stars, with a man who listens more than he speaks." Margaret closed her notebook. "I think people need to hear this, especially women." Miriam tilted her head. "Why women?" "Because so many of us are taught that worth comes from being chosen," Margaret said. "From being pretty enough, thin enough, quiet enough. You weren't chosen by that world, Miriam. You chose yourself. That's rare." Miriam was quiet for a long moment. Then she said softly, "No one ever told me that could be enough." Before Margaret left, she asked for a photo. Miriam agreed, but only if Elias was in it too. They stood side by side in front of the healing hut, his hand resting gently on her back. Miriam wore her beaded shawl. Her braid had small feathers woven into it. Elias didn't smile for the camera, he never did, but his eyes held something better. Peace. Margaret folded the camera back into its case and said, "You know, some people still see this story as a tragedy." Miriam raised an eyebrow. "Then they've misunderstood the ending." Weeks passed. Then a letter arrived by courier, a copy of the Boston Herald folded neatly, its pages smelling of ink and journey. Miriam sat beside Elias as they read Margaret's article aloud, line by line. She was given away in shame. She stayed by choice. and in doing so became more than she was ever allowed to be in the world she left behind. Sierra, once known as Miriam Whitmore, has not just survived. She has become the healer of Haven Creek, a symbol of what it means to find yourself in the ashes of what others tried to burn. Miriam folded the paper slowly, eyes shining. Elias placed a hand over hers. "Do you regret it?" he asked. She shook her head. Not a single moment. That night, as the village settled into sleep and the wind danced gently through the trees, Miriam stepped outside and looked up at the stars. She thought of her mother, of ballrooms and corsets and whispered judgments. Then she thought of yucca baskets and poultices, of children calling her name, of the way Elias's hand fit against hers like it had been waiting all along. Her story was no longer about exile, it was about becoming. And in the stillness of that spring night, she smiled because the world would know not only what had happened to her, but who she had chosen to be. The years did not pass quietly in Haven Creek. They sang their way through the valley with the wind, etched themselves into every sandstone ledge and willow trunk. Time was no longer marked by clocks and calendars, but by harvests and migrations, by the way a child's hand slowly grew to match their mother's. Miriam Sierra, still and always, was no longer the frightened young woman who had once stumbled into this life. Her back had grown strong from work, her fingers deft in healing. Her laugh, once so rare, now echoed easily across the village during cool evenings. Elias's hair had silvered at the temples. He was still strong, still moved like water over stone, but his quiet was deeper now, seasoned with wisdom, not silence. The young men often came to him seeking advice. The children watched him the way seedlings lean toward the sun, and still they had no children of their own. But in a way that only love can understand, they had become parents to many. One bright autumn morning, as Sierra was hanging bundles of sage to dry, a young girl named Lily sprinted toward her barefoot and breathless. "Miss Sierra, you need to come, there's a stranger." Sierra turned. "Stranger white man," Lily panted, "with a suitcase and papers. Says he's here from Washington." Her stomach tightened, but not from fear. It was something else. A signal that life was shifting again. The man was waiting in the village square, standing awkwardly beside the fire pit, with a wide-brimmed hat in one hand and a dusty leather satchel in the other. He looked no older than 35 with spectacles and a nervous smile. When Sierra approached, he straightened and held out a hand. "Ma'am, my name is Thomas Avery. I'm with the Bureau of Indian Affairs." Elias stepped beside her, arms crossed, silent but steady. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Thomas said quickly. "Quite the opposite, actually. I've read the stories. About you, about Haven Creek, about how your village has blended traditional Apache ways with, well, modern practices, medicines, education, peace." Sierra exchanged a look with Elias. Thomas cleared his throat. "The truth is, we need help. There are other communities, small, isolated, struggling to survive between two worlds. Some don't trust the government. Others don't have access to healthcare or schooling." He opened his satchel and pulled out a small folder. "We're launching a new initiative, community-based diplomacy, cultural exchange, they're calling it. And we were hoping," he looked directly at Sierra, "that you might be willing to help." That night, around the council fire, Sierra told the village what Thomas had proposed. "He wants us to be a bridge," she said softly, "between here and there, between old and new." The elders listened quietly. Some were wary, others curious. Elias has always said little, but when he did speak, his words cut through the smoke like clear wind. "The world is changing," he said. "It will come for us, whether we open the door or bar it shut. But if Sierra walks through that door, if we do, We walk with strength, on our own terms. The oldest among them, a woman named Tala, whose eyes had seen 70 winters, nodded slowly. Then teach them, she said. Show them what they've forgotten. Show them that kindness is not weakness, that tradition is not ignorance. And just like that, the door was open. In the months that followed, Sierra and Elias traveled farther than they ever had before, visiting reservations, speaking to both tribal elders and federal representatives, always with care, always with balance. Sierra shared her knowledge of healing, how to use red willow bark for fevers, how to grind yucca root into soap, how to combine ancient practice with modern hygiene. Elias taught the young men how to track game, how to respect the land, how to listen more than speak. Sometimes they were met with suspicion, sometimes with tears, but always with awe. One day, after a long meeting in a reservation outside Flagstaff, a teenage girl approached Sierra and asked, "Is it true you were once like me?" Sierra looked her over, tall, soft around the edges, her arms folded protectively across her stomach. "Afraid of being too much?" Sierra asked gently. The girl nodded. "Then yes," Sierra smiled. "I was exactly like you, until someone taught me that the world needs more of us, not less." Back in Haven Creek, their home remained a sanctuary. When the road wearied them, when the voices of officials grew too loud, they returned to the valley to breathe again. One evening, as the sun sank behind the red cliffs, Sierra sat beside Elias on their familiar ledge, the place where everything had once begun. She rested her head on his shoulder. "Did you ever think it would become this? That we'd go from outcasts to ambassadors?" He chuckled softly. "I thought I was just bringing home a stubborn noblewoman with sore feet." She laughed, swatting his arm playfully. "And I thought you were a silent brute who was going to trade me for horses." "You still owe me 2 goats," he teased. They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars blink into being. "I worry sometimes," Sierra admitted, "that the more we give of ourselves, the more pieces of this place we'll lose." Elias turned to her, his voice firm. "Then we build stronger roots, so deep no one can shake them." The next morning, as Sierra began preparing medicine with the village children, she overheard Lily telling one of the younger boys Miss Sierra used to be from the city. They didn't like her there, 'cause she was round and loud and knew too much. But here, she's like a mountain, strong and soft at the same time. Sierra paused, her heart swelling. She had crossed deserts both of land and of soul. And she had become the bridge they asked her to be, not by sacrificing who she was, but by becoming it fully. It had been 30 years since Sierra first stepped onto the dusty earth of Haven Creek, with swollen feet and a shattered heart. Now she moved with the sure-footedness of someone who had not just survived, but belonged. Her once pale skin carried the warm bronze of countless seasons beneath the Arizona sun. Her hair, now streaked with silver, was braided simply and adorned with beads, gifted by the children she had healed and mentored. They still called her Nalani, the name Niley had once whispered under a starlit sky. The heavens. To the tribe, she was more than healer. She was their anchor in a shifting world, their wise woman who bridged the old and the new. Elias, still strong, though slower, now remained by her side, his eyes ever watchful, his spirit rooted like the great sycamores along the riverbed. Their small home had grown into a living archive. Walls lined with books in English, and Apache journals of healing practices, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling. In its center stood a carved table, where children came to learn to listen and to laugh. But this morning, the home was unusually quiet, because today something would end, and something else would begin. The sun had barely crested the horizon when a low drumbeat began to echo from the central clearing. It was the solstice Sierra's final day as the tribal elder and keeper of women's wisdom. Not because she was being replaced, but because she was stepping aside. A girl named Ava, barely 20, sharp-eyed, full-hearted, had spent years learning under Sierra's gentle guidance. She was half Apache, half Irish, born of a different generation, but bound to the same soil. Her voice had clarity, her spirit. Grace. Sierra had seen it the first day Ava stood in the doorway and said, "I don't want to escape my heritage. I want to grow into it." Today, Ava would be named Nantan Sani Little Leader, and Sierra would watch from the front row, her heart full, her hands resting lightly atop Elias's. As the village gathered, children ran. Barefoot, elders sat in woven chairs, and visitors from nearby towns stood respectfully at the perimeter. Even a few government officials, longtime allies from Washington, had made the journey to witness the moment. The ceremony was simple, no stage, no pomp, only people in a circle. Elias spoke first in quiet Apache. "We are not what we keep. We are what we pass on." Then Sierra stood. She looked at Ava, then the children, then the wide sky above. "I once believed I was broken," she said softly, voice steady. "That my body was wrong, my worth conditional, my future forfeited." A hush fell. But love showed me otherwise. This place, this people, she squeezed Elias's hand. They reminded me that we're not here to be measured. We're here to grow, to give, to heal. She reached for a small wooden box and handed it to Ava. Inside was a single hawk feather and a bundle of dried wild mint. "The feather is for courage," Sierra said. "The mint is for clarity. Both will guide you when your heart is unsure." Ava bowed her head, tears shining in her eyes. The circle erupted in song, an old melody Elias had once played for Sierra on his father's flute. As it filled the air, Sierra sat back down, finally allowing the weight of years to settle into her bones, not as burden, but as blessing. That evening, the stars blanketed the valley in quiet celebration. Elias and Sierra returned to their ledge one last time, the same one where he had once offered her warmth and wordless understanding. Only now their view stretched far beyond the flickering firelight of Haven Creek. Solar panels dotted a distant ridge. A satellite radio antenna stood discreetly among the trees. The schoolhouse roof gleamed silver in the moonlight, its windows lit from within as a teacher read aloud to eager young minds. "You were right," Sierra murmured, leaning into him. "Roots and wings. We built both." Elias chuckled. "You did most of the flying. I just followed the wind." They sat for a long time without speaking. Then Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, smooth, cool white. A single pearl. She gasped, recognizing it instantly. The last remnant of the necklace her father had once ripped from her neck in shame. "You kept it. I found it near the riverbed years ago," he said. "Didn't want to return it until you were ready to see it without pain." She turned the pearl over in her fingers. It gleamed in the moonlight, flawed, imperfect, but unmistakably beautiful. Like her. She kissed Elias's knuckles, a silent thank you for knowing her better than anyone ever had. In the days that followed, Sierra and Elias began writing their story in earnest, 2 weathered notebooks filled with memory and meaning. Not a tale of punishment and survival, but of rebirth. They called it The Heaven Between Worlds. It would one day be published quietly without fanfare, and yet somehow it would make its way into hospitals, libraries, senior centers, into the hands of people who needed it most. Lonely widows, struggling single mothers, overweight teenagers, forgotten veterans. And in each of them something would stir, a sense of being seen, a sense of being enough. Years later, after Sierra and Elias had both passed, peacefully holding hands on a summer afternoon, a new young woman came to Haven Creek. She wore boots too big and a jacket too thin. Her face was drawn with sorrow, her voice barely more than a whisper. The villagers welcomed her with tea and rest, and that night, Ava, now the seasoned elder, sat beside the girl and said, "There's a story I want to tell you, about a noblewoman and a man who saw her not as punishment, but as possibility. And under the stars, it all began again. Not as legend, but as life. Before you go, we'd love to know where in the world are you watching from, drop your city or country in the comments below, and let's build a community of kind souls who still believe in the quiet power of love, dignity, and second chances. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that uplift, inspire, and remind us of the goodness still out there. Thank you for spending your time with us today. From our hearts to yours, we're grateful you're here. See you in the next story.